In this recording, I want to first talk about a controversy between practice and natural gifts in determining how successful an athlete is. And then I want to talk about some medical issues that pertain to baseball. So we're going to start with vision, and we're looking at the back of the retina of a human eye, and you can see that there are two kinds of cells that are labeled here, cones and rods. Cones are responsible for our color vision, and they vary quite a lot in density. Some humans have about 100,000 cones per square millimeter, and some have as many as 324,000 per square millimeter. So you can well imagine that someone that has 3 times as many cones would have more acute vision. So we're going to start by going to Dodger Town, and it's 1992, and the Dodgers have just hired an ophthalmologist, Dr. Rosenbaum, who had been the ophthalmologist for the NFL's Phoenix Cardinals starting in 1988. So he had been hired by the Dodgers to assess the visual acuity of the Dodger rookies and their major league players as well. And to measure visual acuity, what he was using were these charts that are called Landolt rings. And you can see that the rings have a little bit of an opening. It's either sort of north, south, east, or west. And the idea is that you can determine how acute your vision is, because at some point you're not able to see the opening, and the Landolt ring will appear as a circle. You won't be able to tell where the opening is. So Rosenbaum had a set of Landolt ring charts, and he started testing the players, and he found that nearly every one of them could see at 2015 vision. 2015 vision means that what a normal person would be able to see at 15 feet, a person with 2015 vision could see at 20 feet. Another way of saying it is that you would have to, with normal vision, you'd have to be 5 feet closer to see the same image with the same acuity that someone that had 2015 vision would have. So Rosenbaum was amazed because he hadn't seen this sort of visual acuity in the football players that he'd been analyzing, but yet all of the baseball players were sort of off the charts. They were almost all able to see at least to 2015. It turns out that if you model human vision, then the best that any human eye could achieve is 28 vision. So that's remarkably good vision. But what Rosenbaum did was to come back with more charts that would be able to test the players better. And he found, lo and behold, that some of the players could in fact see with 2011 vision. So most remarkable. So he got into a conversation with Tommy Lasorda, and Lasorda was sort of intrigued by this idea of how good vision was, and he was perhaps a bit skeptical, wanted to know if this information was useful. Could Rosenbaum make a prediction about which of the rookies would be likely to do well in the major leagues? And what Rosenbaum did was take a look at the data that he'd collected, and he suggested that this guy, Eric Karros, would be a successful player simply based on his vision. And it turned out in 1992, Karros played for his first year in the major leagues, and he was Rookie of the Year, and he had a 13-year major league career. It was very successful. Lasorda asked him the following year, Rosenbaum, the following year, to pick another player that he thought would have a good chance of making it to the major leagues and doing well. And he picked this guy, Mike Piazza. And Piazza, of course, was a catcher, but Piazza was picked in the 62nd round of a Major League Baseball draft when he was chosen. He was the 1,390th player chosen. And the only reason he was picked was as a favor to Piazza's father, who was a friend of Tommy Lasorda. So Lasorda just wanted to choose Piazza just to give his friend the satisfaction of having a son who was drafted by a Major League Baseball team. Well, it turned out that Piazza's vision served him very well, and he had a fantastic career, was clearly the best hitting catcher in all of Major League Baseball, and just last December, he was elected to the Baseball Hall of Fame on the second ballot. So it looks like that having good visual acuity is a good predictor of success in baseball. Let's take a look at another example, and that's Ted Williams. Ted Williams had his vision tested, and he had 20/10 vision. So that was obviously very remarkable vision. But he bristled when people said, "Oh, you're a natural, that you have these natural abilities to hit the baseball." And he bristled at that because he knew that he'd put in so much practice to try to perfect his swing. And yes, he had great vision, but also he put in the time to make sure that that he was the best hitter he could possibly be. So people talk about him all the time carrying a bat around, or anytime he had any free time, he was swinging a bat, looking at himself in the mirror, just trying to become a better hitter. How visual acuity can be so important in baseball, because it allows a batter to recognize the type of pitch that is coming. So the pitch is coming awfully fast, and the batter is going to use any kind of information he can to try to discern where the pitch is going to end up, how much movement is going to happen. It turns out that different pitches have different appearances as they fly through the air. So a two-seam fastball or a cutter will show seams as it goes through the air. So people that have very good abilities to discern contrast and also to have very good dynamic visual acuity, that is the ability to pick up light and dark areas on moving objects, are going to be at a real advantage. And oftentimes, really good baseball players have that sort of acuity and contrast sensitivity. And you can see that a slider is going to show a little red dot right in the middle, whereas a fastball, a two-seam fastball, or a curveball, or a cutter will show the seams more clearly. So if you have really good vision, then that gives you a bit of an advantage. Some interesting experiments were done where the seams were painted white, and so batters no longer had the chance to be able to distinguish the red dot of a slider from the seam of a fastball. And unsurprisingly, the batters did much more poorly when they couldn't see the red seam. So that turned out to be a very important component. So you may have heard of the idea that 10,000 hours is needed to become an extraordinary performer in any given discipline. This whole idea came from the world of music. And the idea was that a virtuoso would have accumulated 10,000 hours of hard practice before she or he was the age of 20. So you have to put in at least 10,000 hours to become a virtuoso musician. And musicians that put in maybe 7,000 hours were good enough to become professional musicians, but they weren't going to be a virtuoso. That idea was expanded to athletics. And the idea here, of course, is that if you put in 10,000 hours while you are young, then you can become a great baseball player or a basketball player or an archer, whatever sport you want to choose. So there's a conflict between how much of an athlete's ability is determined by genetics and how much is determined by practice. And we can take a look at a famous example, and that's, of course, Michael Jordan, whose exploits on the basketball court were unparalleled. But as you likely know, he decided to stop playing basketball for a year and a half, and he played a full season in minor league baseball. He played at the AA level in Alabama. And you can see that even though he was an extraordinary athlete, that he was not a very good baseball player. You can see that he came to bat almost 500 times, 436 at bats, and he only batted .202, and his slugging percentage was very low. His on-base percentage pretty low as well. So his OPS was .556, which is really not very good for someone at the Double-A level. There was going to be no chance that Michael Jordan would ever make it to the major leagues. So here we have a situation where we have a great athlete, and we don't really know what his vision was like. I don't know of any data on how acute his vision was, but the skills that he developed to become a great basketball player clearly didn't translate to the skills at hitting a baseball. And some have argued that the skills that you might use in becoming a great baseball player had been pruned away as Jordan honed those skills that really allowed him to be a better basketball player. But at any rate, we can see that genetics is important, and we know that having good vision gets passed on from parents to offspring. But on the other hand, practice is important as well. We can take a look at some other athletes, and just as an example, some data were taken on visual acuity of athletes at the 2008 Summer Olympics in Beijing, and the athletes that had the best vision by far were the women's softball team. So their average visual acuity was 2011, and they had very high contrast sensitivity, and they had very good depth perception as well. So they were far better than other athletic teams from the United States in that particular Olympics. It turns out that some sports do demand that you have particular kinds of good vision, and one example is fencing, where depth perception is very, very important. So being able to distinguish even millimeters can mean the difference between getting a touch and scoring a point and not getting a point. So fencers have very good depth perception, but they don't have very good contrast sensitivity, and their dynamic visual acuity isn't particularly great. On the other hand, we have archers, and archers have very good contrast sensitivity, very good dynamic visual acuity, but their depth perception is unremarkable. And of course, the reason is pretty obvious, that they're shooting at a flat target, so being able to distinguish depth isn't going to be quite so critical in becoming a world-class archer. I'm now going to go to some medical issues, and we're going to start with this man, Ray Chapman, who in 1920 was hit in the head by a pitch from Carl Mays, and he died. So Chapman was the only Major League Baseball player that has ever died on the field. His death precipitated several different changes. One is that umpires no longer allowed dirty balls to be thrown, so fresh white balls were given to pitchers. The spitball was soon thereafter outlawed. And of course, its unpredictable flight made it a dangerous pitch. And even though it wasn't until 1950 or so, batting helmets were required in Major League Baseball. So it took 30 years for that particular change to happen, but those sorts of things did occur after Chapman's unfortunate death. So another source of death that happens, but mostly in younger players, and it's called Commotio cordis, essentially agitation of the heart. And what happens is a baseball or any other blunt object like an elbow or anything like that hits the chest of a person right at the perfect time of the cycle of the heart beating. So if that particular projectile hits at just the exact right time, it can cause this phenomenon of Commotio cordis, which essentially is going to cause the heart to start defibrillating, and essentially death can happen very, very quickly. So here's an example of a hit ball that's hitting this young player, and he would be at risk of Commotio cordis. It tends to affect children. So the average age at which Commotio cordis mortality occurs is about 15. And the idea here is that the thorax of a adolescent is not as well developed as the thorax of an adult, so it's able to less capably weather a strong impact in the region of the chest. So here we have Tommy John, of course, the pitcher who was the first person to have the particular surgery that's named after him, the Tommy John surgery. So what had happened with Tommy John is that he'd suffered a injury to the elbow, and he was the first to undergo this experimental surgery to repair this particular elbow injury. It pertains to this ligament that is on the right side of this figure, the ulnar collateral ligament. The ulna is the larger of the two forearm bones. It's the one, the elbow, the end of it is the elbow, and there is a ligament that connects the ulna to the humerus, the upper forearm bone, to help stabilize the elbow joint. And what can happen is that ulnar collateral ligament can be injured, in fact torn, and hence the elbow is no longer stabilized. So here's a close-up showing the position of the of this particular ligament. So you can see that it's an anterior band here and a posterior band here and an intermediate band here. So collectively they serve to stabilize this elbow joint between the humerus and the ulna. So when these ligaments are torn, then again we're going to have a weakening of the elbow, and it's very difficult to pitch well if you don't have a stable forearm. So you can see this particular person has had Tommy John surgery and is showing off the characteristic scar that one gets following Tommy John surgery. And here's what happens. What the orthopedist will do is to go in and drill several holes. So holes in the humerus and also in the ulna here. And then a ligament is taken from a different part of the body and is inserted through these holes to serve as a replacement UCL. So we'll take a look at one such example here. So here we have a ligament or a tendon that's taken from another part of the body, and it is inserted through these holes that were drilled by the orthopedist to help to stabilize that particular joint. So detailed diagram showing what goes on. These tunnels are these drill holes in the bone that are created by the orthopedist, and then the tendon, again taken from typically the forearm or leg, is threaded through to essentially replace the function of the ulnar collateral ligament. And after about a year, then the pitcher can usually get back on the field, and oftentimes with great success. So here's another example of Tommy John surgery. Here we can see the ulnar collateral ligaments were here. They've been replaced essentially by these tendons that have been threaded through these holes that have been made in the humerus and in the ulna. This one refers to Stephen Strasburg, who had Tommy John surgery a couple of years ago. There have been lots of people with Tommy John surgery. Just a few. Here's John Smoltz, and of course Stephen Strasburg, and Brian Wilson. And sometimes position players have Tommy John surgery here. Here's Carl Crawford when he was still on the Red Sox. He had Tommy John surgery. Matt Wieters, the catcher for the Baltimore Orioles, has had Tommy John surgery of late. So it's been a pretty popular surgery. And you can see why. We're going back to Tommy John here. Tommy John had his surgery in 1974. And you can see prior to 1974, he'd had a pretty good career. You can take a look at his ERAs. They were mostly in the twos and threes. You can look at his wins above replacement, a single statistic that measures the overall contribution of the player to team wins. And you can see that his value varied between, once he got started after a couple of years, 2.5 to 4.5, 3.4, and so forth. Then he had his surgery, and he came back, and you can see that his wins above replacement values were a couple of cases even higher than he'd had before Tommy John surgery. So he did have a career that spanned 25, 26 years, I guess 25 years when you take away the year when he couldn't pitch. So Tommy John surgery was certainly a success with Tommy John. You can certainly understand why other baseball players have had that particular surgery. You often will hear about players and pitchers particularly having rotator cuff injuries. And the rotator cuff pertains to the shoulder. So essentially it is this joint between the humerus and the glenoid fossa, which is this concavity in the shoulder blade into which the ball of the humerus sits. So the shoulder is essentially a ball and socket joint where the upper forearm, the humerus, inserts into this concavity called the glenoid fossa on the scapula. And it turns out that there are 4 major muscles that help to stabilize that joint. And you can see them labeled here. We won't worry about their names, but you can see supraspinatus, infraspinatus, teres minor, teres major. But what can happen is a relatively minor rotator cuff injury can happen, where you get a little stretching, and the pitcher particularly will have a lot of aching, have difficulty raising the arm above the head without pain. But in some cases, there are actually tears to the muscles, and that requires long periods of convalescence. Oftentimes, surgery is required. It can sometimes be done laparoscopically, so you don't have to make a long incision. You can repair the muscles that way, but still requires some recovery time, and it also is extraordinarily painful if you have a tear like that. So the aching is very deep and oftentimes more intense at night, so sleeping is oftentimes problematic. But I have a few more pictures of the muscles that you can see there. So these are parts of the rotator cuff musculature. And here you can see the glenoid fossa here on the right, and here is the ball of the humerus, and so they fit in together to make that ball and socket joint, which confers great flexibility, but it also requires significant support, and that support is provided by those 4 rotator cuff muscles. And of course, when you're doing something like throwing a baseball at extremely high velocities, that induces a lot of stress on that particular joint. So one can understand how rotator cuff injuries might be relatively common in a sport like baseball, where pitchers are throwing the baseball at such high speeds for extended periods of time. Here's another picture of that arm joint.